They said Sophie Cunningham joined the Indiana Fever for one reason: to be Caitlin Clark's shield. The muscle. The enforcer. The player who would stand between the rookie and the chaos the league kept throwing at her. And for months, that explanation made perfect sense. Clark was getting tossed around the court like the league forgot she was its most valuable star, and Cunningham had the reputation, the fire, and the bite to put a stop to it. But recently, a piece of information surfaced that completely shattered the simple story everyone thought they understood. Something Cunningham revealed herself. Something that rewrites the entire narrative from the ground up. Suddenly, the idea that she was signed to protect Clark feels incomplete, almost shallow compared to the real motive hiding underneath. Because the truth wasn't about strategy. It wasn't about roster fit. It wasn't even about the Fever looking for toughness. This story goes back years before the trade. Back to moments nobody paid attention to. Back to interviews buried under highlight reels, comments brushed aside as harmless admiration, and decisions that didn't make sense until now. There was a reason Sophie Cunningham pushed for this role. A reason she wanted to be the one standing next to Clark when the rookie storm hit the WNBA. And once you understand her path, the backlash, the bruises, the pressure, the labels she carried, and the mindset she built through all of it, the enforcer narrative starts to look less like an assignment, and more like a mission she carved out for herself long before Indiana ever picked up the phone. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was intention. And the real motivation behind Cunningham's move to the Fever is far more personal, far more complicated, and far more revealing than anything fans expected. Before the story is over, you'll understand exactly why the bond between these two players became one of the most fascinating partnerships in modern basketball, and why everything they built is now hanging by a thread. February 2025 wasn't supposed to be a month that rewrote the direction of an entire franchise, but that's exactly what happened when the Indiana Fever made a move that rippled through the league like a shockwave. In a decision that instantly took over headlines, debates, and social media feeds, Indiana sent assets to the Phoenix Mercury and walked away with one of the toughest, most polarizing players in the WNBA, Sophie Cunningham. And the message behind that trade wasn't subtle. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't something you needed to search for in the fine print. The moment the news broke, everyone knew what it meant. Clark was taking too many hits. She was absorbing too much contact, too many cheap shots, too many borderline plays that somehow kept slipping through officiating cracks. Her rookie season looked less like an introduction to professional basketball and more like a test of endurance, a survival challenge disguised as a season schedule. Fans could list the moments by heart. Kennedy Carter blasting through her shoulder and sending her flying to the floor. Brianna Stewart laying a blindside screen that flattened her at mid-court. Ari McDonald closing out so aggressively on a three-pointer that Clark ended up sprawled across the hardwood. Diamond DeShields barreling into her on a fast break like she didn't even exist. Every game brought another example, another replay, another conversation about officiating and player safety. It wasn't just physical. It was targeted. It was persistent. And it felt like the league wasn't doing enough to stop it. The numbers backed it up. 46 fouls drawn in her first month, the third most in the entire league, and still the whistles barely came when they mattered. Fever head coach Christy Sides was so frustrated she started sending video compilations to the WNBA offices, practically pleading for them to intervene. But nothing changed. Games kept going. The hits kept coming. The tension kept building. And the Fever front office knew they couldn't keep putting their rising superstar in situations where she was one unlucky collision away from disaster. That's when the idea of bringing in Cunningham went from possibility to priority. She wasn't just tough. She was intimidating. She had a reputation. The kind of player who didn't back down, didn't hesitate, and absolutely didn't allow star teammates to take unnecessary punishment. On paper, the move was perfect. Indiana needed presence. They needed grit. They needed someone with an edge sharp enough to defend a franchise cornerstone. Cunningham checked every box. But here's where the story starts bending away from the league's simple explanation. While everyone assumed this was nothing more than Indiana grabbing a bodyguard for their most valuable player, something far more interesting was happening behind the scenes. Sophie Cunningham wasn't just agreeing to step into that role. She was actively pushing for it. She wasn't being assigned a job. She was claiming one. This trade wasn't about Indiana choosing her. It was about Cunningham choosing Clark. Choosing this moment. Choosing this responsibility. And when you start digging deeper into her mindset, her history, and the way she sees the game, the enforcer narrative becomes only the first layer of a much bigger truth. Long before the trade deadline buzzer ever rang, long before Indiana fans started imagining Cunningham standing shoulder to shoulder with Clark, and long before the league labeled her the designated protector, there was a piece of this story hiding in plain sight. And once you understand it, everything, the trade, the timing, the attitude, the loyalty, starts to look completely different. Because Sophie Cunningham didn't walk into Indiana by accident. She didn't fall into the role the Fever needed. She didn't just happen to be available when Clark needed someone tough enough to shoulder the chaos that surrounded her every night. Cunningham had been preparing for a moment like this her entire life, molding herself into the type of competitor who doesn't wait for opportunities. She creates them, fights for them, and refuses to let anyone push around the people she cares about. Before she was ever known as an enforcer, before she stepped onto a WNBA court with a reputation for heat and intensity, Sophie's identity was already being shaped in ways that made her one of the league's most fearless players. At just 6 years old, she earned a black belt in Taekwondo, not because she begged for martial arts classes, but because her parents, who were instructors themselves, gave it to her as a joke. Most kids would have laughed it off. Sophie wore it like armor. That tiny piece of cloth became the first chapter in a lifetime defined by competitiveness that leaned dangerously close to ferocity. Her childhood teammates knew it. Parents of kindergarten kids complained she played too rough in soccer. Coaches saw it when she joined the boys on the football field as a kicker, calmly stepping in after the starter tore his ACL and drilling 2 field goals like pressure didn't even exist. That fearlessness wasn't taught. It was wired into her. She wasn't built for comfort. She was built for confrontation. By the time she reached Missouri, that intensity wasn't something she tried to hide. She weaponized it. She became the all-time leading scorer in program history, a 3-time All-SEC selection, and the heartbeat of a team that reached 4 straight NCAA tournaments. Her stat lines were brutal for opponents. 17 points per game, over 200 rebounds, 80 threes, and 150 free throws in a single season. The only player in the country to hit all those marks. But even with numbers that screamed superstar, the public narrative followed her everywhere. Dirty, petty, too aggressive. Crowds booed her. Rivals hated playing against her. And she never flinched. She leaned into the noise, used it as fuel, and walked into every arena with the same message. If you're not tough enough to handle me, that's your problem. That mentality carried into the WNBA, where Sophie wasn't handed anything. Drafted 13th overall, the first pick of the second round, she knew she wasn't entering the league with the red carpet treatment. She didn't get promised minutes or a guaranteed role. Instead, she fought through Phoenix's rotation with pure force of will. She nearly slipped out of the lineup her rookie season until a sudden stretch of injuries put her on the floor, and she responded with relentless energy, diving for loose balls, sprinting every fast break, defending like every possession determined her future. She wasn't gliding through games. She was grinding through them. And that grind paid off. By 2022, she'd become a reliable starter, putting up 12.6 points and 4.4 rebounds, hitting clutch shots, and even dropping a career-high 36 points in a performance that made the entire league take notice. Anytime Phoenix needed momentum, Cunningham delivered it. Not because she was the flashiest scorer, but because she was the one who could handle moments of chaos without blinking. So when fans saw Indiana bring her in and assumed she'd simply been chosen to protect Clark, they had no idea how far off the mark that was. Cunningham didn't step into a role someone else defined. She stepped into a role she had spent years preparing her mind and body for. A role that aligned perfectly with the fighter she had always been. And the wild part. We still haven't reached the moment where the real truth comes out. The part that proves none of this was coincidence. By the time Sophie Cunningham stepped into the national spotlight as Caitlin Clark's protector, she had already lived through enough battles, literal and emotional, to understand exactly what it meant to stand up when everyone else backed away. And to truly understand why she embraced the enforcer role so fiercely, you have to understand the road that shaped her into someone built for intensity, conflict, and the type of pressure that would break most players long before they ever reached the pros. At Missouri, her name wasn't just on the roster, It was etched into the identity of the entire program. Cunningham wasn't just another recruit. She was the hometown star who carried her school, carried her city, and carried a level of expectation that would have crushed a player who wasn't built for confrontation. Her game was explosive, aggressive, and relentless, and opponents hated how hard she was to stop. Fans booed her on the road because she played with a fire they couldn't extinguish. Commentators questioned whether her intensity crossed lines. But while everyone else debated her attitude, her results never faltered. She became the all-time leading scorer, made 3 All-SEC teams, and put together stat lines most players can only dream about. Yet the narrative stuck to her like a label she couldn't shake: too rough, too emotional, dirty. And instead of running from it, she sharpened it. She turned critique into fuel, the same way she turned contact into momentum. It wasn't arrogance, it was necessity. When you're emerging as a star in a conference filled with powerhouse programs and unforgiving crowds, you either develop a fierce identity or you disappear. Sophie refused to disappear. Her toughness didn't magically transform once she entered the WNBA. If anything, it solidified. As a second-round pick, she wasn't guaranteed anything. Every minute she earned came from grinding harder, playing tougher, and showing coaches she brought something to the floor that couldn't be faked. Intensity that never switched off. She fought for her role in Phoenix possession by possession, eventually breaking through as the type of player teammates relied on in high-pressure moments. Her performances weren't always glamorous, but they were essential. The 36-point explosion against Minnesota. The clutch threes that dragged Phoenix back into games they had no business winning. The playoff bursts where she hit shot after shot and played with a reckless abandon that electrified an entire arena. Every moment like that carved her reputation deeper into the league's identity. Cunningham wasn't a star chasing headlines. She was the player who put her body on the line every single game and didn't care who liked it or hated it. That's why Indiana targeted her. Not because she was simply tough, but because her toughness was threaded into every layer of her game. She didn't stand up for teammates because it looked good on camera. She did it because confrontation was her comfort zone. Because protecting others was something she naturally stepped into. Because she had spent years being the one player on every roster who didn't back down, didn't hesitate, and didn't let opponents intimidate the people she cared about. And yet, even with that entire history, even with the resume that screamed perfect enforcer, most people still had the story wrong. They assumed Indiana's front office had identified the need, made the call, and plugged her into the plan. But the real truth, the one that would eventually shock everyone, was that Sophie Cunningham wasn't just stepping into a role created for her. She had been setting the stage herself, building toward it, wanting it, and pushing for it long before the rest of the world connected the dots. The enforcer persona wasn't something she was assigned. It was something she had quietly chosen. And soon, the moment would arrive when the world finally realized just how intentional that choice really was. June 17, 2025. A date that would permanently shift Sophie Cunningham's public identity from respected role player to full-blown cultural phenomenon. It was supposed to be just another regular season matchup, the Connecticut Sun versus the Indiana Fever, a physical pairing, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. Until one moment turned the entire game, the entire season, and Cunningham's entire reputation into something the league had never seen before. It happened in an instant. J.C. Sheldon reached in during a heated possession and poked Caitlin Clark directly in the eye. Clark recoiled, blinking through the sting, clutching her face, and that's when something inside Sophie Cunningham snapped like a tensioned wire finally giving way. Years of being labeled too aggressive. Years of absorbing criticism. Years of fighting for respect. Years of watching Clark take cheap shot after cheap shot while the league shrugged it off. It all condensed into a single instant of fury. Cunningham didn't hesitate. She stepped forward like she had been waiting for the moment all season long. She put herself between Clark and the Sun players, jawing at the bench, challenging anyone who even looked like they might escalate the moment. Her stance was locked. Her expression was razor sharp. She wasn't just protecting Clark. She was drawing a line the whole league could see, a warning that every player knew she was fully prepared to back up. Benches emptied. Coaches panicked. Players crowded around the scene like they were orbiting a charged storm. And for the first time in the entire saga of Clark's rough rookie campaign, Indiana fans didn't feel helpless. They felt defended. They felt represented. They felt like someone finally stepped into the chaos with enough force to push back. But the real shock came after the game. Overnight, Cunningham went from a tough, gritty role player to a viral sensation. Her TikTok following exploded, from 300,000 to over 1.4 million in a matter of days. Clips of her stepping in front of Clark replayed across sports networks, across talk shows, across every social platform that had even a passing connection to basketball. Her jersey sold out nationwide within hours. Comment sections filled with fans calling her the realest player in the league, the protector women's basketball needed, the bodyguard the WNBA didn't know it was missing. It wasn't a moment. It was a takeover. Suddenly, the narrative around the Fever didn't center only on Clark anymore. The cameras weren't just following the rookie phenom. They were following the enforcer beside her, the heat, the voice, the defender who wasn't afraid to challenge anybody. Cunningham became the second most talked about player in the league overnight, and she did it without dropping 40 points or breaking a scoring record. She did it through pure presence. But what truly set her apart wasn't the moment itself, it was what she chose to do next. Most players would have let the moment fade. Let the hype settle. Let the attention die down. But Sophie wasn't built like that. She had never been the type to sit quietly while something bothered her. And soon, she would turn her newfound spotlight toward one of the most powerful figures in professional sports. A move that would divide players, fans, and league officials in a way no one saw coming. What happened after June 17th was wild enough, but nobody, not fans, not players, not analysts, expected Sophie Cunningham to take things even further. Protecting Caitlin Clark on the court was one thing. That was physical. That was immediate. That was the type of confrontation people expected from a player known for intensity. But what came next wasn't heat of the moment adrenaline. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't reaction. It was deliberate, calculated, and aimed directly at the most powerful person in the entire league. Kathy Engelbert, the commissioner of the WNBA, had become an increasingly controversial figure among players. Decisions felt slow, explanations felt vague, and the growing frustration surrounding Clark's treatment reached a point where the league's silence felt louder than any official statement. Whispers started circulating that Engelbert believed Clark should be grateful for the league spotlight, a comment reportedly made in internal meetings. Whether the phrasing was exact or paraphrased didn't matter. It struck a nerve, a deep one, and Sophie Cunningham wasn't going to let it slide. Instead of venting privately or leaving cryptic comments that could be brushed off, she went straight to Instagram, the one place she knew people would see her words without filters, without edits, without spin. And she unleashed. Calling Engelbert the most delusional leader in professional sports wasn't just a criticism. It was a direct challenge, the kind of statement that most players wouldn't dare whisper in a locker room, let alone broadcast to millions. Cunningham didn't tiptoe. She didn't hedge. She didn't dilute. She fired. And then she backed up every word with facts no one could argue against. Clark had appeared in 21 of the 24 games that broke 1 million viewers during her rookie season. She was the direct reason the WNBA secured a $2 billion media deal, the biggest in league history. Ticket sales skyrocketed. Attendance records shattered. Merchandise flew off shelves. Entire franchises saw financial lifelines because Clark existed. Indiana home games were selling out at a pace the league had never witnessed. The entire economic landscape of women's basketball shifted because of her presence. So when Engelbert insinuated Clark owed the league something, Cunningham wasn't just offended, she was done being quiet. She reminded everyone of who Clark actually was, the all-time Division I scoring champion, breaking Pete Maravich's record, the first player to record a 40-point triple-double in NCAA tournament history, the first to surpass 3,000 points, 1,000 assists, and 800 rebounds, the athlete who drew nearly 19 million viewers for the 2024 national title game, the player whose nil value topped $3.4 million, the phenomenon who changed women's basketball's entire footprint. Cunningham's message wasn't subtle. Clark didn't owe the league owed her. And the internet erupted. Some fans praised her bravery, calling her the only player willing to tell the truth. Others said she crossed a line by attacking a commissioner. Analysts debated whether she was right or reckless. But regardless of the reaction, one fact became crystal clear. Sophie Cunningham wasn't just Clark's enforcer on the court. She had become her defender everywhere. Publicly, politically, and fiercely. This wasn't about clout. It wasn't about attention. Cunningham was standing up for something she believed in, something she felt the league refused to confront. She was saying what Clark couldn't. She was doing what Clark, as a rookie, wasn't allowed to do without backlash. And she didn't care what it cost her. But here's what made the saga even more fascinating. While the world saw a soldier standing up for her teammate, they still didn't know the real truth, the deeper reason behind her loyalty. A truth that would soon unravel everything people thought they understood about their relationship. On the surface, Sophie Cunningham and Caitlin Clark looked like a classic basketball pairing. The fearless veteran and the rising superstar. The bruiser and the sharpshooter. The enforcer and the phenom. It was easy to assume their dynamic existed because Indiana needed it to. Because circumstances forced it. Because the roster demanded it. But beneath all the headlines, the clips, and the viral moments, something far more genuine was forming. A bond that nobody predicted, a connection that turned a strategic trade into something personal. It started quietly, almost invisibly. A few interactions during practice. Playful trash talk exchanged during warm-ups. Small moments that didn't make highlight reels but revealed everything about how two very different personalities found common ground. And the first real sign came not from the court, but from social media, a place where most pro athletes keep things polished, careful, and controlled. Clark posted a joking comment on Instagram during a team golf outing, making fun of Sophie for spelling for as fur. Instead of snapping back or getting defensive, Cunningham leaned into the joke. She called herself a dumbass, laughed about it, and doubled down on the self-roasting. No ego. No tension. Just two people who genuinely enjoyed giving each other a hard time, the same way real friends do. Then came the Ankeny Pro AM tournament. Cameras caught them walking the course together, not as player and enforcer, but as two people who effortlessly slipped into the rhythm of familiarity. They chirped each other. They laughed. They took playful jabs. Clark teased Sophie's golf swing. Sophie told Clark to stop acting like she was too good to carry the clubs. These weren't staged, PR-friendly moments. They were real, natural, human. And that's where their connection became something the cameras couldn't fake. They had chemistry. Not the on-court pick-and-roll kind, but the kind built from trust, humor, and authenticity. Cunningham wasn't protecting Clark because the franchise expected her to. She was protecting Clark because she cared about her. Because she liked her. Because she saw in Clark a reflection of the same fire she carried. The same pressure, the same criticism, the same spotlight that could feel blinding if you were standing in it alone. For Cunningham, defending Clark wasn't duty. It was instinct. It was loyalty in its rawest form. She didn't need to be asked. She didn't need to be told. She stepped into the storm on her own because that's what friends do when the world decides to test someone they care about. And the more time they spent together, the more obvious it became that their partnership wasn't just good for the fever, it was good for each other. Clark gave Cunningham a teammate who embraced her fire instead of questioning it. Sophie gave Clark a veteran who refused to let her face the league's intensity alone. What fans saw on the court was only the outward expression of a much deeper connection. Something that made the enforcer role feel real, not manufactured. Something that made Cunningham's loyalty look less like a strategic advantage and more like a personal mission. But even with all that closeness, the world still didn't know the full truth. The most surprising part of their story, the part that explains everything, hadn't been revealed yet. Up until this point, everything about Sophie Cunningham's loyalty to Caitlin Clark seemed explainable. The enforcer role made sense. The trade made sense. The chemistry made sense. Their friendship made even more sense. But what nobody understood, what nobody even thought to question, was why Cunningham stepped into that role so naturally. Why she embraced Clark so quickly. Why she defended her so aggressively. Why she was willing to put her reputation, her career, and even her relationship with league leadership on the line for a rookie she had barely known. Because here's the twist that flips the entire story upside down. Sophie Cunningham wasn't introduced to Caitlin Clark when they became teammates. She had admired her long before they ever wore the same jersey. This wasn't a bond born from circumstance. It was a bond born from admiration, years before they ever shook hands. Back in 2024, while Sophie was still with the Phoenix Mercury, she publicly said something that barely made ripples at the time. It wasn't clipped and reposted. It wasn't treated like news. It sat quietly in an interview that most people ignored. But in hindsight, it was a revelation. When asked about up-and-coming players she respected, Cunningham didn't hesitate. She didn't tiptoe around names. She didn't offer generic praise. Instead, she said something almost no veteran says about a college star. "I'd love to play with Caitlin Clark someday. For real. I never say that about anyone." She emphasized it, repeated it, meant it. And in a league where players rarely admit admiration for younger stars, especially ones still in college, that was enormous. Cunningham wasn't saying it for attention. She wasn't forecasting a trade. She wasn't imagining a future partnership because of rumors. She admired Clark's game long before the rest of the world caught on. She studied her. She watched her torch defenses from 30 feet. She watched her dissect teams with a level of court vision that didn't make sense for a college player. She watched her dominate under pressure like she was built from something different. While Clark was rewriting college basketball history, Sophie Cunningham wasn't watching casually. She was watching like a player who recognized a generational star when she saw one. A player who understood that Clark wasn't just good, she was era-shifting. So when people assumed Cunningham stepped into the protector role because Indiana needed her to, they were missing the bigger truth. Cunningham wanted to protect Clark. Before the role existed. Before the opportunity existed. Before the trade was even rumored. This wasn't obligation. It was admiration. Respect. Genuine excitement for the chance to play alongside someone she believed in long before the hype caught up. That's what makes her decision even more shocking. Sophie had just signed a contract extension with Phoenix through 2025. She loved the organization. She loved the city. She loved the culture. Matt Ishbia invested in her. The Mercury trusted her. She had a Real foundation there. Players don't just walk away from that. They don't force trades out of places they love. They don't uproot themselves to take on a role as demanding and unforgiving as the bodyguard. But Cunningham did. Because for her, this wasn't a demotion. It wasn't a sacrifice. It wasn't even a job. It was a chance to stand beside a player she had admired from afar, a player she believed could transform the league, a player she wanted to support long before anyone else realized she would need it. So when she stood between Clark and opponents, when she barked at benches, when she challenged the commissioner, when she called out unfair officiating, when she defended Clark at every turn, she wasn't doing it because it was expected. She was doing it because she meant it. Because she cared. Because she chose Clark long before Clark ever chose her. This revelation turns their partnership from strategic to personal, from accidental to intentional, from convenient to profound. And once you understand that, another truth starts to emerge. The truth that makes everything that followed even more heartbreaking and far more uncertain. Just when the feverish rise of the Cunningham-Clark partnership felt unstoppable, just when fans started imagining how far Indiana could go with firepower on one end and fearlessness on the other, everything took a brutal turn. Not a slowdown. Not a setback. A collapse. Fast, sudden, and devastating in a way that not even the most pessimistic fans could have seen coming. Sophie Cunningham's season-ending injury didn't just shock the team, it gutted her. It happened on a play that looked harmless at first, one of those ordinary basketball collisions that usually ends with both players jogging back on defense. But when Bria Hartley stumbled and fell sideways into Sophie's right knee, the impact twisted her leg in a direction no joint was meant to go. She crumpled instantly, grabbing at her knee as teammates waved for trainers. And the moment she tried to stand, everyone watching knew. The season that she had fought so hard for, the season she had imagined for years, was gone. A torn MCL. 3 words that hit harder than any screen, foul, or shove she'd ever absorbed. She announced it on her podcast, her voice shaking with the kind of disappointment you can't hide. This was the year she finally got the chance she had dreamed about. The chance to play beside Caitlin Clark, to take on the enforcer role she had mentally prepared for long before the trade ever happened. And it evaporated in a single, unlucky collision. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the emotional punch of knowing she wouldn't be there to help Clark through the rest of the war they had stepped into together. And as if the basketball gods were rewriting the season with cruelty in mind, it didn't stop there. Later that same season, Clark suffered her own injury, one that pulled her off the court and onto the sideline, ending her rookie year long before she could create the playoff magic fans had been waiting for. Two players who were supposed to redefine the Fever. Two players who fed off each other's energy. Two players who made each other stronger. Suddenly, both were gone, replaced by silence on the bench, cold packs, crutches, and the emptiness of what could have been. The conversations shifted instantly. What if they had stayed healthy? What if the duo had been allowed to grow together? What kind of numbers could Clark have put up if Sophie had been on the floor to keep opponents in check? How many more games could Indiana have won? How far could they have gone in the postseason? Nobody knew the answers, but the possibilities haunted fans. This wasn't just a team losing two starters. It was a franchise losing its identity, its chemistry, its momentum, all in the blink of an eye. But the biggest question wasn't about the season that slipped through their fingers. It was about what comes next. Sophie Cunningham is now a free agent. There is no guarantee she returns to Indiana. No guarantee she and Clark will play together again. No guarantee the bond that electrified the fanbase will continue on the court. Everything the Fever built, emotionally, strategically, culturally, suddenly feels fragile. And in her own words, Cunningham admitted the uncertainty herself, hinting that the future is not promised. The partnership that felt destined now hangs in midair, suspended between hope and doubt, loyalty and opportunity, admiration and reality. The story that once looked like the beginning of a new WNBA era is now threatened by timing, circumstance, and decisions that haven't yet been made. And that leads us to the final chapter. The fate of this duo, the future of the Fever, and why what happens next could reshape the league. What makes the story of Sophie Cunningham and Caitlin Clark so captivating isn't just the toughness, the loyalty, or the headlines. It's the unfinished nature of it all. Their partnership didn't end with a championship run or a defining playoff moment. It didn't end with a dramatic victory or a heartbreaking loss. It ended in silence. Injuries. Uncertainty. A pause button nobody asked for. And now, the entire WNBA is quietly waiting to see what happens next. Because the truth is this, everything about Indiana's future hinges on decisions that haven't been made. Cunningham is a free agent. That fact alone has the Fever fanbase holding its breath. Will she return to the team she fought so hard to join? Will she stay beside the players she admired long before they ever became teammates? Will the bond that became one of the most fascinating dynamics in women's basketball survive the unpredictability of free agency? Nobody knows. And that's what makes this moment so electric. What we do know is that the league isn't the same as it was before Cunningham and Clark crossed paths. Their chemistry changed the Fever. Their energy changed the media landscape. Their presence changed the way players approached matchups, the way fans watched games, and the way the league understood the power of connection. Clark brought an entire generation of new eyes to women's basketball. Cunningham brought the kind of fire that made people stay. Together, they were becoming something more than teammates, something bigger than their roles, bigger than their stats, bigger than their contracts. They were turning into a duo with the potential to define an era. And now, the question hanging over the WNBA is simple. Will they get that chance? Will Cunningham return and pick up where she left off, stepping back into the role she chose long before Indiana ever knew how badly they'd need her? Will Clark and Cunningham reunite as the unstoppable combination fans fell in love with? Or will the injuries, the contracts, and the chaos of professional sports separate them before their story truly begins? The future is unwritten, and that's what makes it so compelling. Whatever happens next, one thing is already clear. The Sophie Cunningham and Caitlin Clark partnership wasn't just a headline. It wasn't just a season. It wasn't just hype. It was the spark of something transformative, something raw and emotional and real, something that reshaped how fans saw both players, and how the league saw itself. If the WNBA gets another chapter of this duo, the momentum they built, the toughness, the trust, the loyalty, the attitude, has the potential to create one of the most powerful on-court relationships in the league's history. And if this wasn't the end? If this was simply the beginning of a story interrupted? Then what comes next could be bigger, louder, tougher, and more influential than anything we've seen yet. If you made it this far into the video, it means you're exactly the kind of viewer who loves deep-dive basketball stories, hidden details, and the real narratives that shape the WNBA. And that's why I want to invite you to be part of this community as it grows. Right now, this channel is still small, but with your help, it can become the place where fans come for the most intense, most researched, and most engaging WNBA content online. So if you enjoyed this breakdown, hit the subscribe button. Not just because it helps, but because it tells YouTube you want more stories like this. Tap like. It boosts the algorithm in a huge way for small creators. And drop a comment below telling me whether you think Sophie Cunningham will return to the Indiana Fever next season. Your comments don't just start conversations. They push this video to more viewers who love the WNBA as much as you do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.